As we drove to Maine, I'm really noticing a little bit of the chilly air, but I'm happy to be here. I love the beautiful state of Maine. But basically, that's what I'm going to be talking about today is instead of, me moving up to the north, the Maine, talking about fish, moving from lower latitudes up to higher latitudes. And, we know that fish move around. If you're a fisherman, any fisherman will tell you that from year to year, fish change where they are. In some years, they are in some of your favorite fishing spots, and then in other years, they're not there, but they've moved into another place. But in general, they sort of stay in the same broad area. And so the shifts that I'm going to talk about today are changes in the geographic distribution that are more persistent and that have occurred over a longer period of time. And I'm going to show you some of those shifts and how they have affected our fisheries and will affect them in the future. This is a map of sea surface temperature for the globe, and as you all know, the warmer water is closer to the equators, and as you move away from the equators, water gets warmer. Well, with climate change, we expect sort of these warmer areas to expand, and so for mobile organisms on land or in the ocean, we expect those organisms to move towards the poles. So those mobile organisms can simply move to higher latitudes. And so we've observed this trend in lots of different taxa, and probably observed this first in terrestrial systems. So this is a figure I've taken from a newspaper article many years ago, actually, in which they looked at the distribution of birds in the winter in the U.S. And so you can see for these 20 different species, their historical distribution is shown in the light blue. And then they compared their winter distribution in the 2005-2006 and found that they were consistently found further north. And what you'll notice is that not all of these distributions are straight north and south. They are mediated by the habitat that these birds prefer, the kinds of foods they like to eat, the kinds of trees they like to live in. And this was all correlated with this increase in winter temperature that's been observed in the U.S. over this time period. And so other people in probably one of the first marine examples to look at this was in the North Sea. And this is showing you a study that was done there with lots of different species. So they looked at species like cod that are obviously really commercially important, heavily fished in the North Sea. But they also looked at anglerfish that's moderately fished, and snake blenny, which you probably have never heard of because it's not fished. And what they saw was a similar trend where cod, anglerfish, this was sort of their historic center of mass, and then they moved poleward over time. And because they saw this in species that were commercially fished and those that weren't, we feel pretty confident that this is related to temperature and not to fishing. In the United States, this was one of the first studies that linked shifts in distribution of fish to climate, and this is off of Alaska. So this is Alaska here, this is Alaska Peninsula. And what they showed was that the distribution of fish was related to the cold pool. And the cold pool, the size of that cold tongue of water, which is shown here in blue, is related to the amount of sea ice. So in years when you have a lot of sea ice, in this Alaska region, the sea ice always melts, and when it melts, it sinks to the bottom and creates this very cold tongue of water. But in years when you have not a lot of sea ice, in the spring it melts, and you have a much smaller cold pool. And so in years when there is a large cold pool, very few fish can actually live in this very cold water, this close to freezing. But when the cold pool is small, fish can inhabit this area. So they see this northward movement of fish off the coast of Alaska, up to 230 kilometers. So that's quite a change in the distribution. And you can imagine fishermen having to travel further to get to these fish that had moved northward. From the study, they also showed that the shifts in species at more northern latitudes, so these are a little bit higher than latitude than the Gulf of Maine, but in general, marine fish and organisms at higher latitudes were shifting 2 to 3 times faster than some of those trends that I showed you on land. So as you probably know, we've seen increases in coastal water temperature in our area of the world. These are 3 time series of water temperatures from Gloucester Point, Virginia, Woods Hole, Massachusetts, shown in pink, and Booth Bay Harbor, shown in yellow. And you can see that, at least for the last 40 or so years, there's been a lot of variability, but a general increasing trend over time. Although you will notice that in the 1950s, it was quite warm then, too. So looking at the Northeast Shelf, so this is Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Here we are in the Gulf of Maine. I'm sure you recognize that. This is showing you the bottom water temperature from 1969. And so the 60s were a relatively cold year, at least oceanographically speaking. And you can see a lot of these dark blue areas. This is water temperature in the 0 to 4 degree temperature range. And that's pretty cold water. It excludes a lot of fish species. However, if you look at a more recent year like 2006, you can see that there's a lack of those really cold areas. And you also see a lot of these warmer colors, which indicate warmer waters. So what we expect to see when we see these shifts or these changes in temperature is that the fish will move northward. Now, because the shape of our coastline is not straight north to south, in the southern part, you might be able to see this north-south shift in distribution. But in southern New England area, where I live now, and in the Gulf of Maine, we actually, the fish will have to move a little bit further to remain within their temperature range because they can't move straight north and south. So these were the shifts, the hypothesized shifts in distribution, what you would expect to see with climate change in the Northeast U.S. And so when I was at NOAA in Woods Hole, my colleagues and I undertook a study in which we used a survey conducted by the National Marine Fisheries Service, in which they sample the finfish assemblages from, oops, I'm giving it all away, from Cape Hatteras up to Georges Bank, Gulf of Maine region, and even some of the Canadian waters. And so every year since the 1960s, they've done a survey in the spring and in the fall, and they occupy or sample about 200 to 400 different places in this area, and they count the number of fish. It's also where we get a lot of information for stock assessments. They collect ear bones to age fish, scales. They collect genetic information. They look at diet, so they open the stomachs up of these fish to look at what they're eating. But most importantly for this study, they looked at latitude and longitude. They reported the latitude and longitude. So for the last 40 years, we have a record of where all the different fish species are. And so we can look at shifts in distribution because of this long time series. And so we're looking for those hypothesized shifts that I just showed you. And so what we found was that we looked at 36 different fish stocks, and we found that 24 of those had either shifted to northward or more poleward latitudes or to deeper depths. So some of these fish species had moved to deeper depths because those deeper waters can be a little bit cooler and more stable. A lot of the fish species had shifted both northward and deeper, and that's the response that you would expect from a climate change signal. Now, some of these observed shifts were due to actual movement, so these fish moving to more northern regions, but others are probably due to changes in population abundance, in which populations at the northern edges of their range increase in the abundance, and populations at the southern edge of the range decrease in abundance. So I'm going to show you some examples of these shifts that we saw, and try to explain some of the mechanisms, the movement and changes in population abundance that explain some of those shifts. So the first example is silver hake. Some of you may know this as whiting. That's what you might see it as at in the seafood market. Silver hake has a very similar distribution to a similar pattern that many of the other species that we looked at. So I like to use silver hake as an example to show you the pattern in spatial distribution that we saw. I also like using silver hake as an example because it is a commercially important species, but it's not as heavily fished as something like cod or yellowtail flounder, which I will show you. And so what you see, so now these maps are not temperature, but they are indicating to you the biomass in kilograms per tow of silver hake. So the red colors indicate a lot of these silver hake, high densities of these silver hake, and the blue colors either indicate no silver hake or very, very low abundances. And so what you can see is that in the 60s, again, that was a very cold time period. You can see the distribution of silver hake pretty far south in the survey. And as you move through time, you start to see fewer and fewer of these silver hake in the southern part of its range. And if you're focused in on the Gulf of Maine, you start to see more and more silver hake within the Gulf of Maine. Now, as we move through the 80s and 90s, you see that trend continuing, and particularly in this time period, you can see very few silver hake in the southern region and higher densities in the Gulf of Maine. And then in the most recent time period for which we did this analysis, you can see that silver hake is very abundant in the Gulf of Maine, and you can see this shift to deeper water, where now you see silver hake right at the edge of the continental shelf. So this is right where the shelf really starts to get deeper. So it's almost like they're hanging on to the edge right there. So that's an example of a more pelagic species. Silver hake do make seasonal migration, so they'll move north in the spring and summer, and south in the winter. So this is a pretty mobile species. In contrast to that is yellowtail flounder. So yellowtail flounder is a flatfish, seen here. So it's not quite as mobile as silver hake. It does move around. They do move around a bit, but certainly not as mobile as silver hake. This is also a heavily fished species. And so what you're going to see in these maps is the effects of both fishing and climate on this species. So in the 60s, we had very high abundances of yellowtail flounder in southern New England and off of Long Island, where I'm from. And if you move through the 70s and 80s, you're going to see the effects of overfishing. So you see the abundance of yellowtail flounder just decline throughout its range because it's being fished and harvested heavily. And you continue to see that trend through the 80s and 90s. In 1992, stricter regulations were put into place for yellowtail flounder and other fish species. And so in the late 90s, we start to see an increase in abundance of yellowtail flounder in some places. And we have had a nice recovery of yellowtail flounder in the Georges Bank area, as you can see by these red areas. But what you notice is that we don't have the nice recovery in the southern New England area, despite the fact that the regulations have been put into place. And so I think one of the reasons that that has happened is because of climate. And so we just haven't had cold enough temperatures in this area for yellowtail flounder to be able to rebound like they have in the more northern parts of its range. And so the other interesting thing that you may have noticed is that historically, you've always seen yellowtail flounder in the Gulf of Maine, but as you move through time, you see these higher densities of yellowtail flounder in the Gulf of Maine. And so it actually wasn't until the 90s that they actually started assessing yellowtail flounder in the Gulf of Maine. And so the Gulf of Maine may be a really important place for this species to be in the future. Yeah?
Last two charts, the red is really the other side of the picture. So the Canadians, not machines, not
Yeah. So I get that question a lot when I show this figure, and if they're Canadian, they always think it's because the Canadian management has been better. But there's a couple reasons why that might be. One is because there's a closed area right near there. We do manage yellowtail flounder jointly with Canada, so we assess them together, and then we should split the catch limit with them. But I think I won't say whether Canadian management is better than U.S. They've recovered on the U.S. side as well. Yeah. Yeah. So we did look at the correlations between water temperature sort of at different scales and how that correlated to some of these trends. And actually what we saw was that water temperature at a much broader scale correlated at least to these changes. So you could look at water temperature and predict kind of where the best habitats for these fish are for sure. But when we look at sort of the trend over time, these are definitely related to water temperatures that are changing at a pretty broad scale, if that makes sense. And then in terms of how effluent, I know there's been some study about river flow into the Gulf of Maine and how that might affect nutrients and water temperatures. We didn't really look at that specifically. But based on our findings that the shifts in distribution are related to sort of more broad scale temperature, they wouldn't be responsible for these large shifts in distribution. So it might affect things sort of closer to the coast and more small scale distribution, but not necessarily these shifts in distribution. Yeah.
You can hold your questions until she finishes.
The depth of water. Yeah. Right. So we did look at depth, and so the species that we're looking at are mostly hanging out close to the bottom of the ocean. And so when we see them sort of shifting into deeper water, that's an indication they're sort of moving along the substrate to colder water. So those are two examples of sort of species that have always been in the Gulf of Maine, but which you might see more of in the future. They will probably become more abundant and have become more abundant. This is Atlantic croaker, and actually this is a species that I studied while I was doing my PhD work in the Chesapeake Bay. And Atlantic croaker they're their young grow up in the estuaries, and so they know that the recruitment success or the reproductive success of this species is is tied to the temperature, the minimum air temperature that it gets to in the estuary. So if the water temperature in the estuary, like the Chesapeake Bay, goes below 4 degrees, we have very low recruitment success for croaker. And so we have a mechanism by which we can understand how how temperature controls the distribution and abundance, really, of this fish species. So for Atlantic croaker in the 70s, you can see that this is a more coastal species. You can see that its distribution was located much further south. But over time, as the recruitment success has increased because of warming water temperatures, you start to see this shift in distribution and northward progression of croaker up the coast. And so anecdotally, I've heard of fishermen around the Cape Cod area collecting Atlantic croaker, large Atlantic croaker, and we have been sampling their young in the New York bays. So what this suggests is that Atlantic croaker is sort of starting to establish populations in these areas where they historically really haven't been seen at all before. So this might be a species that you've not really seen in the Gulf of Maine before, but in 20 to 40 years, maybe they become a lot more common. We've also looked at black sea bass. So the size of these yellow dots indicate density, the amount of black sea bass caught along the coast. And this is just comparing 1973 to 2008. And so what you can see is in the 70s, they were mostly distributed further south. These smaller dots indicate places that were sampled but where we didn't catch any black sea bass. But then when you look at the 2008 time period, you start to see black sea bass in the Gulf of Maine, and there certainly have been newspaper articles about catching black sea bass in the Gulf of Maine. And this is not just a one-year event. This is 2011 now. And again, you see a population of black sea bass really being established in the southern part of the Gulf of Maine. So again, this is a fish species that maybe only occasionally occurred in the Gulf of Maine historically, but now we might expect to see a lot more of them. Another species that is a Gulf of Maine resident is the cusk. This is a cryptic species that likes to hang out in boulders. You can see this is a cusk sort of hanging out in the vegetation on the bottom of the Gulf of Maine. And so we've seen a real decline of cusk in the Gulf of Maine and as well as in Canada. So there's been some concern as to why this decline has happened. Part of it could be due to bycatch from some fishing. So what we did was look at the habitat of Gulf of Maine cusk and look at how it might change in the future. So we used global climate models that predict water temperatures in the future, and we used this, what we know about the habitat of this species. So this is the historical habitat, good habitat for cusk. And we projected what it might look like over time. And so the green areas indicate potential habitat for this species. And so you can see that with a 1 to 4 degree temperature change, essentially when you get to about a 3 degree temperature change, there's really no habitat for this species. So this is a resident of the Gulf of Maine that you may not see anymore. This is sort of showing you that movie statically so you can look at it in more detail. So this is the historical distribution of cusk from 1963 to 2009 on average. And this is what we project for 2020 to 2060 with about a 1 degree temperature change. This is the range of temperature change that we expect for this time period. So this 1 degree temperature change is sort of the average of what we expect the temperature to be. And in 2060 to 2100, you can see the further reduction of the habitat of cusk with about a 1 to 2 degree temperature change. And what's really interesting and also a little bit alarming as a fishery scientist is that this population of cusk, this habitat for cusk, is separate from this habitat. And so when you have, two populations of an animal that are separated by that much space, it can be very bad for for the population dynamics, and for them to be able to adapt and shift to this northward area. They kind of have to go through this area that may be poor habitat for them. Mm-hmm.
How do we know it's just and not a Hail Mary individual? We're brothers.
Right. It is.
Sounds like multiple variables.
There are definitely multiple variables. And in particular for cusk, we looked at temperature, and this is a species that really needs high complexity habitat, lots of rocks. They need to hide in that. So part of the reason that you see this really dramatic decline in habitat is because in places where the temperature might be right, they might not be that hard substrate. And so, most fish species have multiple requirements. So when you put those together, the habitat starts to really decline quickly. So I've kind of shown you the shifts that have happened, and they're pretty obvious when you look at those maps that the changes in distribution have happened. But so what? I mean, that the fact that the fish can move is good for them. They can adapt to these changes in temperature, and the species will persist, and they'll be fine. But people might not be as adaptable. So what are the effects on our fisheries? And so I'll bring you back to some of the examples that I showed you to show you the implications of some of these shifts. So for silver hake, this is a species that is assessed separately as a northern stock, which is in the Gulf of Maine, and a southern stock, which is everything basically south of the Gulf of Maine. And so this red line is sort of dividing those two stocks. And so when we sort of diagnose how well the population is doing, we look at these stocks totally separately. Even though it's the same species, we look at them totally separately. And so if what we are seeing is actually this southern stock kind of moving into the Gulf of Maine, then that kind of gives us misinformation about how well the stock is doing. So I'll show you an example. This is basically how the stock is managed. This is the northern stock. The pink is in the Gulf of Maine, and the yellow is the southern stock. And so you can see that over time, the pink stock, the northern stock, has increased in abundance, and the yellow stock has decreased or stayed about the same. But if you considered this species together, you would get a different result. So instead of thinking that this pink stock is increasing and this yellow stock is decreasing, really what's happening is this is, all one stock shown in green. And so really neither one of them is increasing or decreasing. It's really remained about the same. But I've included the reference points for these two stocks. And you'll notice that the green line is below this southern target reference point. And that's, that's the benchmark for which we don't want to go below that. So it really, these shifts in distribution really challenges us on what our stock assessments are telling us. For yellowtail flounder, I've talked a little bit about this. I'm just showing you sort of 3 snapshots from 3 different time periods. But what this is really the poster child for is how some stocks may not be able to recover. So stocks that are sort of at the edge of their range might not be able to recover under suboptimal temperature regimes. So even though we've seen the recovery in these northern areas, we don't see them in the southern stocks. So we really need to take climate into account when we're trying to rebuild stocks, and will we actually be able to rebuild them under climate change? So, water temperatures have really already affected some of our fisheries. So this is an example of Atlantic mackerel, and the black dots are the historical distribution of mackerel, and the gray dots show you more of the current distribution of mackerel. So you can see that in the spring, most of the mackerel were located off this Delaware, Maryland, Virginia area. And so there used to be a very lucrative mackerel fishery in this area where the fishermen really took advantage of the mackerel coming closer into shore when they were migrating in the spring, and really catching them as they moved inshore and up to the more northern parts of this area. But now that fishery has essentially closed because the fishermen simply don't catch those fish anymore. And it's primarily because, or completely because, these fish are just located further north. So they don't really ever migrate close to the shore for these fishermen to catch them. And you can see that in the landings. So this is Maine and Massachusetts. You can see the landings really haven't changed for those two states, but these are Rhode Island, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia. So all of these states, the landings have plummeted and then are no more. So it can close a fishery, and it's happened. Malin Pinsky and Mike Fogarty did some really interesting work to look at how fisheries and fishermen adapt to these changes in distribution. So now what I'm showing you is red hake, which is related to silver hake. And this is showing you the latitude, the mean latitude at which we find that species. So this is going from New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts area. And so you can see this line basically represents that northward shift in distribution that I've been showing you with the maps. And when you compare that to landings, which are shown here, you see that the landings aren't shifting north as quickly as the fish. So it suggests that the fishermen are not adapting by moving with the fish. And that should make sense because the infrastructure that supports our fisheries, the ports, the seafood processing plants, and the families and communities that are traditionally fish these species, it's not easy to pick up and move and follow the species for which you've really specialized in catching. And Malin and Mike have shown this for a couple different species. So this is red hake. This is the graph that I just showed you. The black line is the movement of the fish, and the gray lines are the movement of the fishermen or the fisheries. And so you can see that the landings don't follow, the lines are not quite as steep. So there is some change in the distribution of the landings, but it's not as drastic as the fish. So how do fishermen adjust to these changes in distribution? And so it turns out that instead of moving with the fish, fishermen will switch and need to switch to other species. And so to capture this, they developed this temperature of the catch. So as this line increases, that means that the fishermen are catching more warm water species. So basically, they look at all the species they catch and weight sort of the temperature preference of the fish. So these have moved in Massachusetts, Maine, Rhode Island, and Virginia have all kind of shifted from more cold water species to more warm water species over time that these shifts have occurred. A different trend in New Jersey. I don't know why. And I'll bring you back to this example from Alaska, showing you the shift in distribution with the cold pool and sea ice. And if you note the trend of the fish that are moving in this direction away from the Alaska Peninsula, you see they're moving towards this Russian-U.S. border. So there was an article in the press in Alaska about how this may set up conflict between Russia. Now, I'm not saying we're going to go to war with Russia over, Alaska pollock or something, but what that means is that we have to start monitoring the distribution and abundance of the fish, not only in U.S. waters, but in the water in Russian waters. And like we do for yellowtail flounder and a lot of species that cross the border in our neck of the woods into Canada, we have to start assessing them and negotiating over, splitting up a quota between two different countries. So that can be pretty contentious and certainly more complicated than just doing it within one state and one country. A similar thing has happened in the Northeast Atlantic, where Atlantic mackerel has been found located more in Iceland and Faroe Islands water. So they've sort of moved west, away from Britain. And so there's some controversy about whose mackerel are these anyway? Are they Great Britain's? Are they Iceland? Are they the Faroe Islands? And so again, I'm not saying that these countries are going to go to war, but they're calling it a mackerel war to refer to the cod war, which is an incident where Iceland and Great Britain almost went to war over the cod that had moved into Iceland waters. And the navies of these two countries got involved. And that was before the establishment of exclusive economic zones. So now we have, some more rules in place to prevent those kinds of things. But it certainly, again, will cause conflict, and it requires us to work with neighboring countries, and that's also similar conflicts are happening between states in the U.S. as these fish move into different state waters. Some states want a larger part of the quota than they have traditionally been getting. I thought I'd talk about river herring since I'm in Maine. So this is some work that we did with alewife and blueback herring, which some of you may have known were petitioned under the Endangered Species Act recently. They were not listed under the Endangered Species Act, but as part of that process of determining whether they should be listed, we now have to consider the effects of climate change and how that will affect the population persistent of some of these species. And so what I'm showing you here is the probability of occurrence of alewife and blueback herring, which sort of make up the river herring complex over time. And so this is the historical distribution of these two species. And so yellow indicates higher occurrence and blue indicates low to no occurrence of the species. And then we're projecting forward again with these climate models for the 2020 to 2060 time period, and the 2060 to 2100 time period. And so for these species, what you see is actually an initial increase in some parts of the Gulf of Maine, in A and B. You see an initial increase. But then by the time you get to 2100, you then see a decrease. And when you combine sort of the percent change in habitat or occurrence of these two species, overall there's a 21% decline in the amount of habitat. So, even though we start to see some new species and fishermen can maybe adapt to the occurrence of new species as other species move out of the area, with climate change, these warming trends are going to continue. And so we have to be really careful about how we manage these new species or species that are increasing in abundance. And so particularly for river herring, for this work we showed, initially there's an increase and then followed by a decrease. But we also found that if the population abundance is high, there's a little bit of controversy as to whether it's high or low or sort of moderate. But from our modeling, we showed that if it remains relatively high, that this species can really adapt fairly well to climate change, even increase as waters warm, at least in some areas. And so this is really, a warning message that now is the time to conserve river herring and to open up more freshwater habitat to give the river herring and other species a chance to adapt and persist under climate change. So some concluding thoughts before I end. I hope what I've shown you here is that we're already seeing the effects of climate change on fish distributions. And, we see a lot of changes in the terrestrial environment, but for people that, like us, that live in coastal communities, when we start to see different fish in the fish market, that really hits close to home. And both fishing and climate, as well as other factors, can induce shifts in spatial distribution. And we really have to think about these two factors together. But climate is also a major factor in preventing recovery of the fish stock. So we've seen that in yellowtail flounder and perhaps Atlantic cod. So we've already seen these changes in distribution and productivity have caused changes in our fisheries, and we will continue to see those changes. And so our fisheries need to be more adaptable. So I always like to put up solutions. I don't like to gripe a lot about something without trying to put up a solution. Obviously, I couldn't not say, but we really need to lower emissions. And there are other good reasons to lower emissions other than, we want to keep the fish that we like to eat in our waters. But again, it's a very real example for coastal communities. We need to more effectively incorporate climate into our stock assessments. That's how we set target catch limits. And we need to incorporate climate into recovery plans. So we are often too optimistic about how quickly a stock can recover after overfishing, and include it in our management decisions. We need to allow fisheries management to be more flexible. So, we've seen that the fishermen aren't able to move with these fish, but they are able to switch to fish other species. So we really need to make sure that the management is flexible and it allows the fishermen to switch from one species to another. And, the tough part, I think, is going to be coordinating with neighboring states and countries to monitor the abundance and distribution of these fish, assessing them, and managing our fisheries. So before I go, I want to acknowledge all the people at NOAA who, in particular, all of my collaborators listed here. Those are all NOAA employees, and the data that I used to show you these maps were all collected from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center Trawl Survey. And so that was started in the 1960s. Of course, the people that began that survey never dreamed that we'd be using the data to look at climate change, but it's proved to be a really valuable resource. So we have to make sure these kinds of surveys are funded. And this was also funded through NOAA Fisheries and the Environment Program. And so with that, I'll take any questions. More questions?